We have a very special guest with us today. He is an Emmy Award winning writer for his work on Robot Chicken. He's, of course, beloved in the X community for his legendary New Mutants run, as well as his current run on Hellions. He's the reason I am obsessed with Doug Ramsey, and I am just so thrilled to welcome Mr. Zeb Wells to the show. Zeb, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. It's great to be talking to you.
I literally have heart eyes right now, Zeb. I recommend your New Mutants run all the time. And I was over the moon when it was announced you would be back for Dawn of X because I love your writing so much. You are one of my
Ah,
favorite writers.
Thank you so much. That run of New Mutants is one of the things that I think turned out the best. Like I'm actually legitimately proud of that. I think that we just found a good emotional ending, and I really liked giving some sort of closure to Ileana and that long drawn out era of trauma she had around that like childhood, truly terrible childhood she had in hell. It was fun to like think that like that was like a way to bring a little bit of healing to that character while leaning into that trauma and also having her be sort of scary and a badass.
Zeb Wells, I love hearing you talk, but Zeb Wells, why is Madeline Pryor dead?
Oh wow, that now I want you to know that
Sorry.
that hurt me. That hurt me just as bad as it hurts anyone else. I was not chipping away on the keyboard laughing as I did that. That was very painful for me, but it felt like that had to happen to honor sort of the big ideas around that character, like what that character had been through, and sort of that character's story is not one of triumph. It's more like that whole character arc is kind of a scar on the X-Men's psyche because she was treated so badly and didn't get a fair shake. It just felt weird to have her get a fair shake, bringing her back in this context. Now, I won't say one way or the other. It's Krakoa now. No one's story is necessarily over, but that's how it felt that needed to end. But it hurt me.
What was some of the Twitter reactions you got? Because
Well,
I mean, I was probably one of them, with the hashtag justice for Maddie or crying emojis all over my feed.
well, I loved all of it. I really did. And what kind of blew me away about it is I don't think any of it was like all of the anger was towards Scott or the Quiet Council. It
Oh,
didn't seem like any of it came to me, which I was expecting. I thought people would be mad at me, which to me proves that people kind of understood it or understood how it was organically part of her story, even though it was upset. So if I had read that story, I would be tweeting the same things, but I was sort of relieved and happy that none of the pure hatred was coming towards me. Like people were upset, but it didn't seem like anyone thought that the writing was bad, which made me very happy.
no, Zeb, you did such a great job with writing that first arc, and your writing historically is always very tight. I mean, you're an Emmy award winning writer, okay? So,
Right.
but I think what you did is incite a lot of passion for fans. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. When we're there in that scene where Havoc is sort of outside and Alex comes out, or excuse me, when Scott comes out and he's here like, oh, we voted. It's more about the situation. And I remember I was on a salty thread with some of the other ex podcasters, and we were like, oh, Gina and Emma were like, nope, we are not bringing her back.
Totally. Yeah, I wanted people to be suspicious of that decision. Like I don't think people should take that decision at face value. Obviously, they said, well, we can't resurrect clones. That may or may not be true. Obviously, you're in a room with Emma and Jean and Scott, and he's talking about his ex-wife, and surely Scott has a lot of shame around that situation. Like that doesn't make him look good. I'm
No.
just sure that there was a lot of stuff in that stew. And that's what I thought was important, that it happened off panel
Yeah.
so that people would have questions about it and sort of fill in the blanks about what was going on back there. So that's great to hear.
Was it your decision to have that clone role, or was that an editorial Hickman role that would just happen to get fleshed out in your story?
There is a lot of discussion behind the scenes about how that works with a timeline like the X-Men's, which is full of copies of people, other, characters from other dimensions. And you know what? I think I might have even messed up there, because I think the rule as discussed was like you couldn't have doubles of, you
Yeah.
can't have doubles of characters, like, or characters from a different timeline,
Hmm.
resurrections of the same character. And I might have like worded it poorly when I
You
said
did
clones,
not.
which set up like a massive firestorm, because people are like, well, what about the cuckoos, and what about blah blah blah. And but I think it was all good discussion, and these are the same, which makes it so exciting to be working on the X-Men right now, is that there are always discussions like that going through. But once I had put it out in that book, like Leah's on X Factor, and a lot of her job is sort of solidifying those rules. So she's taken that and run with it. And I've seen her and Vita like really picking that rule apart and trying to make it solid and concrete. So it's all being discussed at the highest levels, I guess.
Yeah, no, I don't want to dwell on this too much because this could be a Madeline Pryor podcast. I have her right there. I put her there
Oh, that's so
specifically.
cool.
But no, I think what you did was incite a conversation amongst fans and how these
Yeah.
rules are. And I think what's so great about this new era, the dawn of X, the reign of X era, is that there's so much world building and conversations are happening about the X-Men. These stories aren't just they get published and you forget about them. You can actually marinate on them. And a character like
Yeah.
Maddie has so much rich philosophical questions already baked into her history that now this is just another chapter, hopefully.
Totally.
Just another,
And
not an
one
end.
of, yeah. And one of the things that really drew me to the Dawn of X stuff and Hickman's writing on House of X, Powers of X, was his willingness to have uncomfortable situations and have no easy answers. He's comfortable with having characters on both sides of an issue being right and asking questions. Obviously there are things that the council have done that are shady from one perspective, but might be good for the long-term health of mutants. And one of the things that I thought was really compelling was, I think X-Men were always made palatable because they were superior, but they also said, well, we're going to fight and protect for this world that despises us. And then in this new version, the world that despises us is being ignored. They're kind of like, no, we're no longer going to protect you guys. We're going to protect ourselves. And there's something scary and dangerous about that, that the whole line sort of leans into, which I'm really finding compelling.
Absolutely. And I think the mutant metaphor has morphed so much since Hickman's era. But I want to kind of go back on what you were saying because I think that original metaphor of protecting a world that fears and hates you is a reason why a lot of us fell in love with the X-Men. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about you. What was the first memory you have of the X-Men or your first exposure to them?
Man, it might have been in it was probably in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. There was that one episode where he meets the X-Men.
Yes.
And after that, you kind of wished he would meet the X-Men every episode, because it was just so fun to see them. And then that Iceman, was an X-Men who was in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, who I always loved. I thought his powers were so cool. And then when I started getting back into comics, I think it was like right before Inferno hit was when I was really started buying and reading comics. And by that point, there was just so much going on in every issue of X-Men. And even if I read those issues now with my adult eyes, it's almost like there was too much going on. It's like
Mhm.
there's so much mythology, but it never bumped me as a kid. You knew that there was a massive world. You knew that these characters had relationships that went back decades, and you just wanted to know everything about them.
You literally articulated why I love the X-Men so much. And my era was the mid 90s with Joe Mad and Onslaught.
Uh-huh.
And that I always say what I loved about the X-Men was it pulled on a curiosity for you. And you had to pull
Mm-hmm.
that thread because you saw, Storm there, you saw Nate, Gray, and you were curious about those characters. But at the time, you didn't have the gift. The kids today have like it's so easy because they can just go onto Wikipedia, type in Storm, Nate, whatever, and get their whole history. We had to go to the comic book store and
Yep.
we had to look up, you know?
Yeah, and A, you had to hope that they had the issues you were looking for. Then
Yeah.
you had to hope you could afford them,
Hmm.
and you had to like put it together yourself. And so you were kind of it turned us all into little archaeologists, who were trying to
Absolutely.
get funding for our digs, and then we would go to our digs and unearth this stuff, and it made it all so special.
It's funny that you said that because with the podcast, we have an Instagram and it's a very engaging Instagram. And people are always like, oh, you guys post so fast. And it's so easy because all you have to do now is just go to your Marvel Comics app, take a screenshot of whatever you want. I used to work at Wizard Magazine back in 2007. And
Wow, was that towards the end of
that was
the?
towards the end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wow, 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 wow.
So I didn't really have the opportunity to go on the internet and find images if I was doing an article on like Green Goblin. I had to go to our archive room. I had to know which Spider-Man books to find. They weren't organized. I had to find the issue, flag them, and give them to our production team. And can you
Wow.
imagine doing that today? It would be,
Yeah. But it made it all feel like the information was a little more valuable.
yeah, because you had to go out and seek it.
You didn't find it made the myth of these stories even bigger in your head,
Yes.
and I noticed that like when I started doing research for New Mutants, because I went back on New Mutants and I read, just everything that I could, which I didn't do when I was younger. So you read these stories that you've been hearing about for like 20 years, and there's something so and sometimes they're much smaller stories than you thought they would be in your head, or sometimes they're a bigger deal, and it's just a really cool situation.
Oh, I agree so much with that because the only thing I had about Inferno when I was growing up was a little Fleer Ultra card that
uh,
just gave me a paragraph summary of Inferno. And it wasn't until, I got older and I sought out the trade paperback and read it. I mean, that run in particular, excuse me, that crossover in particular is very rich and a lot is happening there. But
yeah,
they're a good source for me, and I don't know if you've ever used them, is uncannyxmen.net.
I must have.
They're
I must
great.
have.
They actually
Yeah.
list everything with like photos and everything. But okay, wait. So I want to know who is your favorite X fan?
I I hate to be this basic, but it's got to be Wolverine.
Oh no, you're
I
not basic at all.
Wolverine, and then Ileana as a close second.
Mm,
Um, because I think trauma is so interesting, and it shows itself in so many ways, and it's hard to find a more traumatized character than Wolverine. Like he's so messed up because he's kind of seen lifetimes of it before.
yeah. Have you written Wolverine?
I have written Wolverine in Spider-Man comics.
Gotcha.
And I do think Wolverine makes a fantastic guest star because
Oh yeah.
he, you can play him as the wild card. You can play him as someone that they're trying to contain. You never quite know how Wolverine's going to react to a situation because he can be so violent, but you can also catch him on a day where he's really bummed about how violent he is and he doesn't want to be violent. There's a lot of flavors to him. I wrote a story with him with it was a Spider-Man short where he invited Spider-Man out to a bar, and they just have like a nice night, and they get into a fight and whatnot, and then it's revealed that it's Wolverine's birthday, and he wanted to spend it with Spider-Man because Spider-Man hasn't spent enough time with him to know that he's like a killer, and like there's all this blood on his hands.
Oh.
Spider-Man still sees the best in him, so he just wanted to be with someone who didn't know that he was a killer for his birthday. It was kind of a sweet little tale.
I love that. And talking to you now, I'm slowly like realizing a lot of your work does deal with trauma. And I think you do such a good work, or excuse me, I think you do such a great job of rendering that on the page. I'm thinking, and I told you this when we were emailing, I love that scene with Hope saying, "Win first, cry later." And then
Yeah, yeah.
even in the most recent issue of Hellions, we see them in their own virtual realities and sort of the traumas they've endured and how it profoundly affects them. And you do such an amazing job of rendering that pathos.
Yeah, I think I am just fascinated with that stuff. And I do think writing in general has just been a very valuable way for me to poke at my own feelings about things and poke at what I think, or um, or like process my own trauma, and
Yeah.
process. I think that it's interesting. For the first 15 years of my writing career, I was such a procrastinator, and it was very tortured process of writing.
Hmm.
And my therapist now says that he thinks that when you sit down and write, there's really nowhere to hide from your feelings. It all like comes up.
Yeah.
And I think that for a long time, me sitting down and trying to write and getting so upset was the process. Well, my body basically begging me to deal with my own stuff. And so I think it's all connected. Like I'm really attracted to that stuff, and it's all my brain trying to figure out just how hard it is to be a human being sometimes, because I do think it's hard for everybody, and we all have our traumas that we have to deal with at some point.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm kind of mesmerized with what you're saying, but I'm actually writing a memoir, and
Uh-huh.
I'm shopping around with my agent right now, and it's all about intergenerational trauma and the trauma we
Mm-hmm.
inherit from our parents.
Yeah.
And I have procrastinated on it so much to the point that some bits of it's not fiction, obviously, so some parts of the proposal don't feel really fleshed out, and a lot of editors have called me out on that. And it's
Uh-huh.
because it's so painful to sit down and like
Yes.
really dig deep there, and not only dig deep and unearth those emotions, but then find a way to spin it into a narrative.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's just not good at all.
Yeah, it's kind of, you're going to be forced to look at that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think writing in general, if you're doing it well, you're in a state of vulnerability
Yeah.
as you're writing, because you're trying to get down to the real stuff. And I I just, for so many years, it's like, oh, I'm a procrastinator. Oh, I'm a procrastinator. And then it's like, oh no, you have horrific trauma that you
Oh my
need.
God, I'm sorry. I don't mean
and,
to laugh at
and no,
that.
it's funny. It's like, oh, you
No.
have a bunch of feelings that you really don't want to feel. and
Yeah, no, that's a great way. Thank you for I could have used you in my writing programs. That is a wonderful way of putting that. And I have some really great writing mentors, but no one has ever articulated kind of like how you did it just now.
yeah, so I would just say, like, really pay attention to how you feel when you don't want to write. And a lot of times there's like some really scary feelings under there. Like there's,
Oh,
it's
oh, there it
interesting.
is.
The more you
Uh-huh.
become aware of it, the more you can like game it and sort of work with it instead of working under it.
I got you. Well, okay. So back to X-Men.
Okay, back to the fun stuff.
Back to the fun stuff. Which is your favorite X-Men crossover?
Well, I mean, I think it doesn't matter what I say, because objectively, the work says that I'm obsessed with Inferno, which I think I must be, which is it's just so weird because I went back to reread it, as I said, when I was researching New Mutants, and it was really hard for me to follow. Like there was so much going on in that crossover, and you could tell that the writers were working really hard, but they were sort of figuring out the big crossover thing, and rereading it, I didn't find it the most satisfying story, but when something gets to you at that impressionable age, the feelings around it are so strong, and the iconography of that crossover and the big themes that are underneath everything seems so strong to me that I just feel like I keep getting drawn back to it. Like I can't get Madeline Pryor out of my head. I can't get the demonic New York out of my head. Like the Empire State Building that was
Yeah.
growing like miles above the city. All of that stuff just got me at the right age, and it's deep, deep into my subconscious now.
Havoc in his Goblin Prince outfit.
Oh man, so good. So good. Just reading that as like a 10-year-old, being like,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
yep,
Yeah.
yep, sure, yep.
So, speaking of you as a 10-year-old, when you were a little Zeb, I know you said in another interview you used to flip through the channels and you would stop when you saw things like Super Friends or Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends because you were so enchanted by superheroes, their colors and how flamboyant they are. Was it that love for superheroes that sparked your passion for writing?
I I think have it must I don't it's so strange what draws you in when you're a kid, but you're especially like you grow up in like the early 80s, and even just the style of homes back, it's all very drab and brown,
Oh
and
yeah.
you know what I'm saying, and like fall colors, it's just very fall colors. And
Where did you grow up?
so I grew up in Manhattan, Kansas, and then moved in third grade to Littleton, Colorado. So did most of my growing up in Colorado.
Oh, that's rad. My dad was, I'm a first generation American. My dad went to law school in Kansas City, Kansas, and popped me out
Oh,
there. But then I
that's
grew
where my
up,
mom's from.
oh, dope. 4 months later, then they moved to Miami and
Okay,
yeah, from
okay.
Miami. But anyways, I'm sorry to cut you off. Continue.
Yeah. And just with everything being that drab, those little dashes of color, they were just important. They just felt good. So seeing those superhero cartoons, finding old Spider-Man comics, I think it just wired my brain to say that that's the fun stuff. That's the good stuff over there. And I remember when we started writing in first grade, and I remember it because I think it felt so good. But we were all writing stories, and I don't know why, but in my story I was taking a walk and I ran into a giant squid, and I don't know why I thought of that or where that came from. I'm sure there was some reason, but when I read it to the class, they all just burst out laughing. And I don't think I was even trying to be funny. I was just writing something, and that felt so good.
Yeah.
That I think that's where I realized that like writing was a way I could express myself that people enjoyed, or you could get that hit of validation.
Yeah, I love that sometimes you're just born with a talent and it just comes out. And in moments like that, you weren't trying to be funny, you just wrote a
No,
story.
yeah.
That must have felt like a really great reaction though.
Oh yeah. I mean, I still remember it. It felt so good. And then that seemed to like happen. I just remember times where I would say something or write something, and you get people and people start laughing, and they're not laughing at you. They think it's funny, but you weren't necessarily trying to be funny. And then at a certain point, you're just like, oh well, maybe there's something about my voice or my writing that people like, and it just starts drawing you in that direction.
When I used to work in publishing, one of my authors was David Sedaris.
Mm.
And when he was doing his lecture series, he'd have his story in front of him and he'd write, a check mark or draw a little skull if the audience did not react to where he was meaning to react, but then he'd check mark the parts where people were reacting to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool to have a discipline or a craft where you can get that type of feedback,
Yeah.
where there's no BSing you, oh, you can tell when someone's reacting to it or not.
Yeah.
And that's good feedback to get. That's where as comic book writers, you have to get your feedback where you can, because you're kind of by yourself all this time.
Oh,
Well, that's where it's good to have an editor or whatnot, but that's why I do I you do I did struggle with comic book writing, and I would bounce kind of back and forth between TV and comic books, because the TV is more of a social
yeah.
thing. You get a lot more feedback, even just a writer's room. You get to see the look on people's faces as you're saying something. And where with the comic book writing, there were times where I could just get in a spot. I could just start spiraling because I didn't know if what I was doing was good or not. And so, and before you know it, you burned a week, and then you end up writing the whole thing in a couple of days, and you don't know what's good, what's up, what's down. Basically, what I'm trying to say is comic book writing will murder you if you don't discipline yourself. That's what I'm. I was working on my inefficiently trying to find my process and my discipline, and that's what finally allowed me to do this and not drive myself crazy.
Well, I think it's safe to say a lot of your work has landed with fans. So my next question is, you're reading all of these comic books growing up. As an adult, you're revisiting them. Is there a particular, is there an ex-writer that inspired you? Is there someone who you're just like, man, look at that work? And obviously a lot of them are great, but was there just one in particular?
Wow. Well, when I was growing up, I mean, it was Claremont. It was like
Oh yeah.
began and ended with Claremont, and it was so weird going back. He's such an interesting writer because going back and researching New Mutants and reading some old X-Men, which I really respect about him, he becomes a different writer depending on what artist he's working with. Like some of this, that Bill Sienkiewicz New Mutant stuff reads completely different than other stuff. And I think that the sheer amount of ideas he jammed into his run of X-Men,
Oh
writers
yeah.
today, we're still, to use the archaeology metaphor again, we're still going back and digging up stuff because he was just throwing
Yeah.
so many ideas at the X-Men. There's X-Men space stories, there's X-Men pirate stories, there's interdimensional stories. So I don't think you can talk about X-Men without Claremont. And then it was obviously very exciting when Grant Morrison came along
Oh
and
yeah.
sort of took the next big, what I thought was like a recontextualization of everything, and kind of took everything that came before and said, hey, here's maybe what all that means, and here's a big run. And then I think for the next 20 years, that was being dug into and churned up, and
Oh,
sort of the
absolutely.
X-Men writers were kind of trying to figure out what all that meant. And then that's why the House of X stuff really, it's a big reason why I got back into writing comics, is because I could tell that Hickman was kind of doing that again. Like, someone's doing it again. Someone is making a grand statement about X-Men. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be fun? Wouldn't it be awesome? I'm jealous I can't write on that, or be a part of that. And I was like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Maybe I can. Maybe I can. And
I love that archaeology metaphor though, because
mm-hmm.
I agree with you, especially with Hickman right now. It feels like every issue of his X-Men, he's planting seeds for something new. I've said in the past that kind of frustrates me because I can't keep up with everything. But hearing you kind of delineate the ideology about that, and how other writers such as yourself can go back and sort of source from
Yeah.
the story
Yep.
something new. I When you went back and reread New Mutants and Inferno and you started writing New Mutants, did you uncover anything perhaps that you didn't either see there before or was planted and never followed through on?
Yeah, and I'm sure there's probably more than I can remember because it shocks me, but that was almost 10 years ago
I
or
can't
maybe
believe your
more.
run was 10 years ago.
I
I
know,
honestly
I know,
cannot believe that.
I know. It is crazy.
It is baffling to me.
Yeah, and but I know that I picked up that those Inferno babies had not like they had just disappeared, like they had been handed over to the government. Like, hey,
Yeah.
here's some mutant children. And so that was one that I was like, and that's one where it seemed like even the writers were having trouble keeping track of like how many there were. And I remember like I had charts out. I was trying to like figure out, and what genders and ethnicities had
Yeah.
been designated for the babies. And so that became, and then I loved how that was connected to Ileana. And then there was just going to be some way to connect everything to, just give her some sort of journey of healing with something that was connected to the run. And I thought that the Inferno babies, even if you didn't remember that story or never read that story, you could wrap your mind around that concept fairly early. So, evil government guys got their hands on 10 mutant babies that no one checked in on and could
No.
basically do whatever they wanted.
So, how did you get to New Mutants? I know Nick Lowe came to you and sort of said, "We
Yeah.
want to relaunch New Mutants," and you were like, "Yes, absolutely." How did you go about establishing that relationship with Nick, and how did it come? How did you feel about writing New Mutants when it was pitched to you?
Yeah, I cannot remember if I had worked with Nick before or not. I don't think I had, or maybe he went from assistant editor to editor at that
Hmm.
time. Not quite sure. But I think that like I never really read New Mutants because when I did read the Inferno issues, and it just quit, and then the Liefeld stuff, which I was super into,
Oh,
and then it turned into X Force. But like I said before, New Mutants was one of those things that I knew occupied a big headspace in the
hmm.
fandom, and I knew that was a big deal, and I knew from osmosis how important those characters were. And so for me, I saw it as an opportunity to do a longer run on something and maybe like really make a statement about show what I could do over more of a longer form. At the same time, not knowing if I could do that. So you want to challenge yourself a little bit. Because I had just put together such a string of like mini series and shorter stories.
Yeah.
And for me, like probably my favorite comic growing up was the Peter David Hulk stuff, which
Oh,
just went
yeah.
on for like so many issues. And so for me, that's part of being a comic writer that I aspired to, was like having a big long run on something. So yeah, it was a mixture of thinking I had something to offer, really wanting to dig in on those characters, and I just knew that people loved those characters so much. And the last couple times um, the New Mutants had come back, you need a time and a place where you can get all those characters back together. And I just thought that we could get a good number of them back together and see how those characters had grown since they were brought into the school.
I remember when I saw the preview for Your New Mutants with Ileana falling through her portal and getting up, and she has all the arrows in her, and her saying, "Am I home yet?" And the other image that just resonated with me as well was Danny backed in a corner, and like the doves are flying from her. And I just knew from the get-go you had something special there. And it was just so evident that you were such a fan, and it was such a pleasure reading that run. And that's why anytime people ask me for recommendations for comics, I'm always like Zeb Wells' New Mutants. And I can
Oh man,
remember
that's so cool.
I can remember walking from the subway with my husband, and we were going to our apartment and just talking about your chapters specifically in Second Coming and how much we enjoyed them and how you nailed that relationship with Hope and Rogue, for example. Like you just
Hmm.
had such a good, I now understand talking to you. You just had a very good sense of pain and trauma and how that sort of builds into the DNA of a character. And
Yeah.
it was just so wonderful reading those.
Yeah, I loved doing that Second Coming, and it was kind of similar with the X of Swords issues of Hellions, where you sort of get together with a bunch of people and they kind of do the hard part for you. So it's like, hey Zeb, your issue of Second Coming, this, as far as plot goes, this has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen, and it like takes all this pressure off. So then all your brain has to do is say, well, what's the coolest, most character version of this happening? What's the cool, like, how can I make these things that I know have to happen as special and fun, and reveal as much character as possible? And I think that's the fun part of writing. It's like you try to make your plot as fun as possible, but then when you get down to actually write the pages, it's all about like what's the most emotionally true, most fun, most novel way of getting this information across.
Yeah, I'm curious. Wait, so I want to trace your history here with the X Office. So you did your New Mutants run, and you were done. Did you want to come back? Was the door open for you to come back?
So what, after New Mutants, I did a little, what did I do? I did Spider-Man,
Hmm.
or the Joe Madureira Spider-Man,
Yeah.
maybe, but then there came a point where I started doing more work at Robot Chicken, which was a
Hmm.
show I started working on and started directing on. And again, like I had not figured out my comic book process. I had not figured out how to not drive myself miserable writing. And at some point, my wife was like, you can't do both of these things. It's like it's too much. And I was glad she did, because that allowed me to focus on the TV stuff. And then my wife, my show, and then I ended up doing a show called Super Mansion. So basically,
Yeah.
TV and animation kind of took all of my time for like 4 to 5 years. And then my show ended. I was kind of adrift at sea. My wife got cast on SNL, so we moved to New York. And then Nick Lowe showed up like Nosferatu around the corner. I was like, "Hey, Zeb, come have lunch." You could do a 5-page Spider-Man story if you wanted, or 10 pages. And I was like, and I had sworn off comics, not because I didn't love comics. I could not love comics more. But I just felt like when I was writing them, I was always late. I was always like procrastinating.
Mhm.
I just couldn't make it work in my life. But Nick was like, "Hey, come on." And then I had done a lot of work on myself in that time. And then when I sat down to start doing the stuff that Nick was giving me, I was like, "Oh my God, I think I have this figured out. I love this." And so that led to the Spider-Ham miniseries, and that led to the Ant-Man miniseries, which led to me being invited to one of these Marvel writers retreats. But then Hickman was there. So during that retreat, I think like during one of the breaks, I just beeline towards him. And I was like, "Hey, I know you've got your X-Men summit next week. If you wanted an extra set of hands at that." And he was
I
like,
love that
"Well,
you invited yourself.
I totally." And he was like, "No, that's not really how that works. But if you wanna, if you wanna, if you wanna write something for the X Office, I'd love to hear your ideas." And I was like, "Okay, okay, okay." And and then so he ended up calling a couple of weeks later. We talked, and I was, that was, it kind of felt good to me that I like was the initiator of getting Hellions, and And what I liked about Hellions was that I was such a fan of what Hickman and those other writers were doing that I knew that if I got Hellions, I had to bring my A game. Like I would have to do the best work that I was capable of just to not look like a complete jackass against what everyone else was doing. I think House of X and Powers of X, I know it's gotten a lot of praise. I don't know if people realize just how good that is, like how hard what he did was, to do that level of table setting while telling a story that holds together, while telling a story that emotionally holds together and has an emotional arc. I'm just such a fan.
Zeb, I am an X-Man, diehard X-Man, but I'm a gay boy first. And I am obsessed with your wife, by the way, with Heidi Gardner. How is it being Mr. Heidi Gardner?
I love it. It's I'm so proud of her first. Like I'm such a fan of hers. When I met her and when we got married, she was a hairdresser. She was doing hairdressing and I was just such a fan of hers and I thought, oh, I think that I married one of the funniest people on the planet. Like, but she wants to be a hairdresser. Maybe it must be because I love her so much or I'm just so into her, but I think that she's so funny. And then suddenly she was taking improv classes and then she just kept excelling and now she's on Saturday Night Live. It's
I
so cool. And
I love that sketch with them at the psychic reading,
yeah.
and they're like, "Oh, this has been such a terrible year, 2019. Goodbye, hello 2020."
Yeah.
But her reaction when she was sitting there and they were talking about the father, I just genius. My husband and I
Yeah.
literally laughing the entire time. So I just want you to know that's on repeat in our house.
Love
Like
that.
we're big stands of you guys. I didn't even know I was a stand of you couple until like I realized you guys were married. But going back to the X-Men, what so you pitched Hellions to Hickman. So you handpicked the characters you wanted, or were you sort of been like, okay, but here are the characters you need to do that with?
Well, it was a mixture of both because like I didn't get there at the beginning. I got there when there were already like a good number of team books that were going and characters had
Yeah.
been taken. So there was a certain type of character I wanted. So it was a very small window because I wanted them to be characters that would be very distasteful to be around to the rest of Krakoa because of um, what they had done in the past. Like Grey Crow is the perfect example, an empath.
Mhm.
These are characters that have that blood on their hands that are antisocial. I guess that's the way to say it. They had to be antisocial. And but I thought like Omega Red, what a perfect character, to show that Krakoa has to grapple with these characters that do not fit in and are unpleasant to be around.
Yeah.
But Ben Percy had like an incredible story already mapped out. So it was a little bit of a mixture of me like grabbing for things, getting my hands slapped, and then like with Nanny and Orphan Maker, it was like, hey, I want these two, and Jordan was like, we can't put Nanny and Orphan Maker on a cover. I'm sorry. And but slowly but surely I won him over on them. And then speaking of covers, it's like, well, who is going to be on the cover? Well, Psylocke's available. And then, well, does she make sense? Well, she's got blood on her hands. She doesn't really make sense as antisocial though, but she does make sense as someone who has a foot in maybe both the worlds, who could be sort of a caretaker of these characters or a principal basically. And then with Havoc, again, I've always loved Havoc. There's the Inferno stuff,
Yeah.
but does he really make sense? But then you look at his history and he's got a lot of trauma. He was a villain for a while because of the Axis stuff. And maybe if we showed that stuff was like creeping back on him, we could justify putting him on. And then I think it was Hickman who said, yes, Mr. Sinister should run this thing.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. And then before you knew it, I had a team that I just absolutely adored. Which is my job as the writer of the book, is to adore these characters, but it wasn't hard with this group.
Well, it's so obvious you adore these characters. And I think you've taken Peter and Nanny and made them fan favorites. So I have a couple of contemporaries I kind of spitball, you know, ideas and questions with. And when I said I was going to be speaking with you, literally two of the people I speak with on a regular basis. One of them is Chris from Planet X-Men on Instagram. He was here like, ask him about Nanny and Peter. Ask him all these questions about Nanny and Peter. I'm like, I can't do the entire interview about
Yeah.
Nanny. But so how does it feel that you've created these characters? You didn't create these characters, excuse me. You've created a new fan base for these characters.
It feels great. It feels, I think something that I think, and these are ideas that I've kind of come to over the last couple of years, but it seems like there's something very special if you love something, passing that love on to someone else is like
Yeah.
such a special thing to do in this job. In our, I think it doesn't matter how much the readers care about a character as much as how much the writer and the artist care about the character. Because if they love those characters, it will come through, and I think that's infectious. And with Nanny and Orphan Maker, they're just another duo of characters that hit me at the right time and really took my imagination when I was younger. Like, Orphan Maker looked so cool. He looked like this badass sort of evil Iron Man type character. But then he talked like a child, and you're just instantly like, what is going on there? And I think for me, that is my favorite question, and my favorite feeling when I'm doing research is when you see something and you're like, wait, what is going on there? Like, what made these characters do that? How did they get there? And then you just dig in. You just start asking those questions.
Oh, yeah. It's funny because other characters that you've brought back, which, by the way, sidebar, you kind of have a knack for bringing back characters who have been MIA for a while. You did that with Doug, with Legion, with Maddie, with, the team on Hellions. Is that deliberate, or has it just kind of worked out that way for you?
I think there's something deliberate about it where, with Legion and New Mutants, I just knew that was a big part of New Mutants mythos and a big part of X-Men mythos. So when I saw an opportunity, or that they hadn't been used for a while, it's like, oh shit, yes, I want to be the person that gets to bring them back, and sort of like polish them up and put them on the stage again. I don't know why that feels good. Maybe there's like a selfish thing where like you want to make your mark, but I think there's also a thing where you just want to play with the important toys.
Yeah, and you also brought back Doug Ramsey in such a really interesting way. And listeners, I'm a huge Doug Ramsey stan, and this is why. Because when he came back into Necrosha, his power set was so different than what we had seen before. He could read architecture, right? Like, so I'm thinking of that scene where he's coming in during Necrosha with his team, with Celine's team, and he can read the actual building structure. But one of the most tender moments, and again, it goes back to trauma, was when he went up to Magma, and Magma did not want anything to do with him. But he's here like, I created a language specifically for you. And he just whispers something in her ear, and that's it. She's fine. And that was a moment I fell in love with Doug.
Yeah, I love that moment too, which sounds gross to say, but I'm just like,
it's a great moment between
that
two
was one of my
friends.
favorite moments. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just so wonderful, and again, it's a testament to your writing. I'm sorry, I can like gush all freaking night about how much I love your writing. I'm
I'm
sorry.
not complaining.
So you did mention in an interview recently that you didn't know that New Mutants had landed as well as it did until like a decade later because people
Yeah,
were like
yeah.
asking you about that. Is it because the internet just wasn't what it was today? Do you think social media has played a role in being able to like solicit feedback once things are published?
Yeah. I mean, because Twitter was around back then, but I mean, I don't know if it's comic fans in general, but I think X Twitter is like a very, very vibrant community. Like,
I'm sorry.
um, no, and
For
which
me.
for a writer, an obsessed writer, and it's good and bad, um, but everyone's so passionate now, and you get so much more feedback. And yes, like I just feel like when those New Mutant issues would come out, I could find maybe one or two reviews about it when it came out, and most of the reviews were just like, "Hey, this is decent." Like, yes, this is a comic uh, where a story is taking place, and so yeah, it just didn't feel like it was hitting, and that's the thing with this business. You just always have to do your best work and just hope that it connects, and I have to be honest that it was a little discouraging because I didn't think it had connected. I thought that, like, okay, you're getting better at connecting, and I did feel like I got better as a writer writing New Mutants, but I wasn't quite there yet. I hadn't quite learned how to connect. So it really does mean a lot to see that story 10 years later seems to be around, or it seems to be in people's headspace, or at the very least part of those characters' story that people talk about.
You've you said that writing comics was the first time you got a paycheck. What was that like, writing something that you were so passionate about and holding that check in your hands? And then what did you spend it on? And then what did you spend it on?
Man, I'm sure. I mean, I guarantee you, I spent it poorly, but I was probably paying bills, or paying back money with it. But it was a very special thing. But I was also very young, and like, I don't know if you know how I got into comics, but
No, I don't.
I was just an idiot in college, and me and my friends used to make like dumb funny videos, and Wizard magazine had a video making contest. And so I entered that with my friends. I had a friend that looked like the Incredible Hulk. We painted him green and did a short film. Calling it a film is a gross misrepresentation of what it was. But we made a funny video about the Hulk losing his job, so he had to be like a caddy and a short order cook, and
That's
his
hysterical.
life ends up going off the rails. That won a Wizard contest. I won that contest 2 years in a row. The second year, went to Wizard World. There was an award show. Axel Alonso saw the video and like saw the speech that I gave, and offered me the chance to write a comic book, like a Spider-Man's Tangled Web number 12. So a Spider-Man comic book when I was like, I think I was 23.
Wow.
So I was just out of college. And so that was very special, felt very cool, but I also felt very, very overwhelmed and very much like, do I know how to do this? Like, what? And when you're a big comic fan, you care so much about doing a good job. Like, there was not a part of me that wanted to have fun and just see where my muse took me. Like, there was a lot of pressure I put on myself. Like, this has got to be good. You are getting a chance to write for these characters you've loved your whole life.
Yeah.
Um, so it's been a long, long journey getting to a point where I'm having fun writing.
And I love that origin story because I feel that so many folks that we've spoken to have similar stories. And I happen to have worked at Marvel as well. And I worked with Axel, and he's a genuinely nice guy.
Yeah.
And I love that back in the day, the comic book community was very tight. People were like lifting each other up. It's so different now. I mean, I haven't
Hmm.
worked in comics in a minute, but the industry is so different now. It's so hard to break in, or it's
Yeah.
so hard to like get your voice elevated, even if you go to these conventions.
Yeah. 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 It's so hard. And it's so hard when people ask me advice on how to break in because everyone's just got such a different story.
Yeah.
Um, and, but you meet all types, man. You meet all types of writers. You meet, like that first convention I went to, I met and was hanging out with Robert Kirkman when all he had was like his Battle Pope stuff that he
Oh my
had like had just willed into existence with his own determination. Like that was a guy that was going to make comics whether someone told him he could make them or not. Like I have no doubt that if his comics never sold more than 5,000 copies each, he would still be doing them. I don't I think that's what he does, He's unstoppable.
Well, Bendis had a similar story too. He used to like photocopy his comics, staple them himself, and just,
Mhm.
whatever local comic book seller. I always say this to people too. Where there's a will, there is definitely a way, and you will create
Yeah.
your own opportunities as long as you are willing to go through with your passion and actually
Yep.
kick it up to the next level. Let me ask you, what do you think as an ex-writer you've brought to the table that no other writer has done before? Sorry. No.
Well, I don't know if I've done anything wholly original, but I do think that I have brought, or this is a very hard question. I've tried to bring an affection for characters that are hard to love or have really hard personalities to enjoy, and tried my best to show that, like, if you meet an asshole, you're probably meeting a very hurt person underneath all of it, which is very hard to accept sometimes. I think it's very easy. I still do it. It's very easy to write people off and say, "Oh, that's a piece of shit. Oh, that's a bad person."
Yeah.
Blah blah blah, and that's usually not true. What you're usually looking at is someone who's very hurt, or their trauma process or their defense mechanisms are unsavory to you. And so I'm trying to blast these unlikable characters with as much love as possible and see what's under there.
I love that response because I agree wholeheartedly with you. And I think some of the reasons why a character like Emma Frost, for example, does so well is because you can write her off as an asshole or a bitch,
Uh-huh.
but she's actually one of the most deep feeling, caring
Yeah.
teachers for mutants.
Yeah.
I mean, she is a teacher first. And I love that approach that you have for
Yeah.
characters. And that's why someone like Empath, you're like, what a jerk, but you're like, oh shit, there is
Yeah.
something brewing underneath there. And same
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Alex, same with Psylocke. And I think that's also why Nanny and Peter have resonated so much because not only are they a little off-putting to, other characters, but as the reader, you have the gift of seeing them in a very intimate moments and
Yeah.
seeing their
Yeah.
relationship together and that dependency they have.
Yeah. And those relationships are so compelling because they can get so weird. Those dependent relationships, and again, it's just like seeing behaviors like that and saying, "Oh, that's not just a piece. Those characters aren't just pieces of shit. Oh, what happened to these poor characters that is how they have chosen to live their lives, and how that behavior makes them feel safe. That's how they feel like they have to act in order to move through the world. That, and starting to peel that back. That's very compelling to me.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of Madeline and Havoc and that relationship
Mm-hmm.
you've kind of fleshed out, which makes so much sense thinking of Inferno and then also thinking of, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the book? Mutant X,
Mm-hmm.
right? And bringing that to the forefront and seeing how Alex operates and his empathy and sort of soft spot for Madeline.
Yeah, yeah. And and there's all sorts of stuff mixed into that, like the fact that he is his big brother's ex-wife, and that,
Oh,
and you always, I think,
yes,
feel
the
a little bit of
drama.
inferiority to your big brother, especially if your big brother was Cyclops, and yeah, there's just so much in the stew there, and that's what I have to give so much props to Claremont for. He added so
Oh
many
yeah.
ingredients to the stew, because you do feel that he deeply felt all of those characters' trauma, like those scenes from Around Inferno when Madeline Pryor sees herself as Jean Grey, like taking her body parts off until
Oh
she's a
yeah.
mannequin. That is like, even reading that as an adult, I was like, oh, that hits hard. Like, that is, I think a
Yeah.
lot of people can relate to those feelings. That hits really hard.
We did a Justice for Maddie episode a couple of weeks ago. It ended up being 3 hours. It was supposed to be a 45-minute discussion. It ended up being 3 hours. But the one scene everyone talked about was that scene with Maddie, where, those parts are being removed of her face and she's just a blank mannequin. Is it writing a very flamboyant, crazy, over the top, sinister? It must be the best thing ever.
It is the best, and just having that flamboyant version that Kieran created and that Hickman leaned into, and uh, the first issue before I started writing it, I think it was one of Hickman's, because he had read my outline, and just one of his notes was Zeb, Mr. Sinister has to chew the scenery in every single scene that he's in. And he just underlined it, chew it. And I was like, okay. And so I think the first time we see Sinister is when he says something like to the guy sitting next to him, he's like, are your shoulder pads getting bigger? Because if you want to do this, I'll be on your ass every step of the way, man. You're not, my shoulder ornamentation will not be undone. And I was kind of like, well, let's see where the ceiling is here. Let's see if this is too crazy. And nobody said anything. So you just keep making him more flamboyant, which has made him so fun to write
Oh,
and
yeah.
so lovable, even though he's such a bad character. Like, so he does such bad things, but he's so lovable. That was such a gift of the X Office, and I mean, I'm so glad I get to do Sinister stuff.
Well, you know who's also chewing the scenery? Arcade.
Yeah,
This last issue.
yeah.
How is it like? How do you? Okay, what I'm trying to ask, what I'm trying to formulate in my head is a question of how do you differentiate Arcade and Sinister so well, even though they're both over the top characters who steal the scene, and yet here they are. And I love the scene when Sinister's like, no, 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 I'll talk, I'll give you the clones. And Arcade's like, no, actually, I still want to torture you. Like,
Yeah,
you're like, this Chucky doll's attacking me. Sorry.
it's so ridiculous. That was definitely a concern when I started writing Arcade, because you do want them to be different. And this is going to sound like really out there and masturbatory, but what I try to do when I'm like thinking of Arcade's voice, what I try to do is just think about how Arcade as a character, and seeing that big toothy grin as he's torturing people, how that makes me feel. Like what's like the impression I get from just what I've absorbed about Arcade, and can I somehow turn that into a voice? And so I think if I can do that, if you effectively do that, then the voice rings true to other people that have grown up seeing that character do things and seeing that face. And then it somehow, and I couldn't even explain to you how it's a different voice, but it does feel different to me. It feels like it's a different flavor of this, which is kind of similar. It's like this weird, self-absorbed, homicidal insanity. But in my head, at least in my feelings, it at least feels like a different temperature or color
It
than the
certainly
sinister
does.
stuff.
It certainly does. And that's why it works so well. It's kind of like the Freddy versus Jason of X-Men right now.
Yeah.
Zeb, we've come to the part of the interview where I'm going to just be a thirsty X fan and be like, can you tease us on some things? You can feel free to pass if you want. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But
well,
can I?
Yeah.
I have a couple. What can you tease us about Hellions?
Okay, about Hellions. Man, there's stuff. I don't want to give any of it away. I really don't. And I've never been this type of guy.
No, it is totally.
But let's talk about the Hellfire Gala, because
please.
I do think that I just could not be more excited about this thing. This was an idea that Jerry Duggan had that kind of gets filtered through the really special way that X-Men comics are being written right now, which is this X Slack that we have, where all the writers are on there just constantly churning stories and ideas with each other. And it has been very special to me during the pandemic to just be having this sort of social structure. And then B, just seeing these things take on a life of their own. And Jerry just having this idea of, there's going to be this event. If anyone else wants to be involved in it, they can. And I don't know what I can tease, but just seeing suddenly the artists are contributing. The editors are being like, okay, well, this stuff you want to do is much more work for us, but let's do it, and then it's just like in the last couple weeks, you start seeing art coming in and you start seeing what everyone has put together. And that's when I made that tweet where I was saying that like people aren't ready for this, because I thought when Jerry pitched it that it was a good idea and something that I would like to be involved in. And now I'm thinking that Jerry deserves like a massive raise and might be a genius, because I think it's going to make such a big splash.
I'm speechless because we are so excited for the Hellfire Gala.
I will say that I think that it is a very interesting thing where people get to choose how they play in that world, which is very fun. But it goes up to 10 on the Met Gala of it, and then we go a couple notches past 10. So, and that's all I can say about that.
That's it.
All I can say about that. But if you're into that shit, you are going to lose your mind. I will say is the looks.
I am so excited for it. You don't have to say anything else. I'm just going to babble. I have done anticipation posts of what people are going to be wearing. I have Rogue and Gambit as Justin and Brittany in the matching denim. Emma, of course, is going to wear something beautiful and grand. But then Jean will have a dress from like an outlet in Orlando because I love my girl Jean. I am a huge Jean stan. But so I'm letting you know that everyone in the X community is so excited for what you guys are doing. And I love that Jerry came with the idea and everything.
Yeah. And what I do love about it is that it will deliver. Like people that are excited about it, and for the reasons they're excited, it is going to deliver on all of those things.
I
all of
love
those things.
that so much. Is there anyone in the fashion community that's caught wind of what you guys are doing? Like, has Anna Wintour been like, yes?
I don't think so, but I wouldn't be surprised if after a few of these things come out, if that doesn't happen.
Zeb, thank you so much for your time tonight. Where can fans connect with you?
Well, I've got a Twitter at Zeb Wells, and that's about it.
And you're great.
Uh,
You responded to all my memes of being a Maddie stan. I'm sorry for spamming you with them. I literally have nothing to do at 3 a.m. with my insomnia.
oh, I love those memes. Those were fantastic.
Awesome. All right, guys. I am the Uncanny Dayspring signing off.